Hey guys, what's up? So they finally, well, not finally exactly, but a while ago, they made Lord of the Rings into a movie, into a bunch of movies and spin-offs and movies and lots of different things. Rings of Power was another spin-off that they did from Lord of the Rings movies. And what's interesting is they've been making Lord of the Rings movies since back in the day. They had the Hobbit cartoon, the animated movie, back all the way back in the 80s or whatever it is. I mean, they were like, it was way back. And The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books by Tolkien were written years ago, way before anyone was making really fantasy movies, and way before fantasy movies were even that popular. If you go way, way back, fantasy movies were not that popular. Sci-fi movies were not that popular. It really wasn't until I would say Star Wars came out, Battlestar Galactica came out, before these movies became popular. It took a while. It took Buck Rogers to come out on TV. And then all of a sudden you had a lot of other movies coming out in sci-fi and fantasy. You were talking Lex, Babylon 5, right? There were tons of movies that were coming out. And Lord of the Rings was one of the more obvious ones, and it's still, to this day, I think, like, there are so many good books, so many great fantasy books that came out, and the question is, why did they make movies out of Lord of the Rings and not other stuff? It took them years to make Game of Thrones into a series, right? But Game of Thrones came out in the 80s. I remember, I got the Game of Thrones book, which I couldn't read. It's weird. I just put it down, and I'm sure that if I watched more into the series, I would get into it, because I only watched a few episodes and I was like, I'm not really that into it. I felt like it wasn't fantasy enough, but then they became more fantasy, like the Mother of Dragons came out and all the monsters came out and whatever. It became way more fantasy than that. And so with Lord of the Rings, it was like the same thing. I felt like I read the books, almost all of them. Like I read The Hobbit, I read the first two books, so the Two Towers and the first one and everything like that. And I read halfway into Return of the King, right? And so, and I just never actually finished Return of the King. I just found Tolkien's writing to be hard to read. And in the middle of Return of the King, it's the story of the two hobbits. And it just goes on and on with these two hobbits, which really nothing is happening. Nothing new is happening, nothing good is happening. I'm sure like toward the end of the book, things start to like move and things start to happen, but those two hobbits and their story, it's just, okay, we're following the Hobbit story again, not a lot of action, just like, these two hobbits trying to survive and trying to, continue their journey to the end of the book, to throw the ring into the, river, wherever they were going to do that. And they were going to the big, the mountain, what's going on. So I didn't actually read it, but the Lord of the Rings, they created a bunch of like movies out of it. Like even if you look here, and the movies were actually really good. If you look here at Return of the King, that came out on Blu-ray. This came out like in 2003. You can see on the back here, it says that like it got Best Picture as well as 11 Academy Awards. And that's just really interesting because I only saw some of these movies and I didn't actually know it got Best Picture. I wasn't really following like the Academy Awards, so I didn't know it got Best Picture, but that actually is prestigious. That actually is pretty cool. It means that this is good, so eventually I'm gonna have to watch these. You know what I mean? And like, in 2003. So that came out a while ago. So the early 2000s, we had like, that. The other one, here we go with The Unexpected Journey. They made that into a movie, and this also came out like probably before Return of the King. And well, this one came out in 2012 or something like that. So I guess it's not the same thing. I don't even know. I'm not sure exactly when this came out, but this says 2012. Basically it came out back in the day. This other one, this is interesting. I didn't know this one existed, and I don't know if this is different than Unexpected Journey. It looks like it might be, because I know I didn't see it yet, but this is Desolation of Smaug. Smaug is the dragon in the story, and the Hobbit Desolation of Smaug is like, well, that's got to be different than Unexpected Journey. And Unexpected Journey is the book. right? As far as I remember, and Destination of Smog must be a different story of The Hobbit, so that's cool. And so that's really even cool. And if you look at like the stories that are coming out, I actually think, literally, I really do think that the Lord of the Rings would make better movies. I mean, the books were really good. The books were good. I mean, a lot of people feel the books are great, right? I liked them. I enjoyed them. They weren't my favorite books ever. Not because of the story, but it was a couple of things. One is Tolkien's writing, the way Tolkien writes. There was a lot of writing in there without a lot of action, without a lot of the story being moved forward. There's a lot of like stagnant writing. There's a lot of like writing where you're reading and reading and reading, and you're reading basically nothing. It's just, they're just going on and on and on and on. Like when you started, they were like, oh, this is the village of the hobbits. Like, okay, when's the story gonna start? Right? And of course it did start when Gandalf came in, when Bilbo found the sword, the story started to go when they met the elves and the dwarves and the monsters and things like that. The story started, and I think one of the most interesting, the best characters in the series is definitely got to be Gollum, right? Gollum is such a cool character. If you think about it, he's way more interesting than Bilbo. He's way more interesting than Frodo. Gandalf is a great character, and I just think, I'm not going to say Gandalf is a takeoff of Merlin, but I am going to say, but the thing that he is, but the thing is, anytime you have a wizard, your classical wizard, it's going to be a takeoff from Merlin. It just is. I mean, he's got the exact same things about, he's your quintessential wizard. Right? He's got his long hair, his beard, he's got his robe, he's got a staff, talks in riddles, uses all kinds of magic, very, very wise. He's Merlin, And what's interesting is that, like, I think Merlin must have been the first actual proper, like, wizard. I mean, there might have been wizards, but, the wizard with the wizard elements, like the staff and the cape, and, the guy looks like a wizard. You could even say that, like, Excalibur was the first magic sword. And since then, you've had tons of magic swords. You had Sting. I do believe that in The Hobbit, the magic sword was Sting, the one that Bilbo had. And then you had, Stormbringer from the Elric saga and things like that. Of course, and the sword and, special magic swords or special swords just go on and on. Even like in Star Wars, you had the lightsabers, which was like, let's take a sword and let's make it sci-fi. Right, but let's also associate it with magic, So it's a sword, but it's a weapon of the Magi of Star Wars. A weapon of the Jedi, which were the Magi of. It even has I at the end of the word, right? So it was your sword that the Magi used, right? The weapon, and it definitely wasn't as powerful as blaster, which can shoot at a distance, but with a lightsaber, you can actually block blasters being shot at you. You can actually deflect laser beams being shot at you. You can deflect them if you're a Jedi Master, that knows how to use that sword. So I do think that fantasy, I think stories in general, a lot of them, I think what you could do is almost every good fantasy book can become a movie. And this is why. There's a few reasons. One is it's super interesting. Another reason is people prefer watching movies to books. And the proof of that is that, like, no one talked about Lord of the Rings before the movies came out. Even when the Hobbit cartoon came out, not a lot of people knew what that was. Right? Even like back in the 80s, you had the Hobbit cartoon and you had Gandalf and you had all the halflings, like Bilbo and stuff like that, all the elves and the dwarves and stuff like that, that came out way back in the day, but it wasn't a major motion picture. It wasn't recognized by the Academy Awards. It didn't have like this actor who's a very, very popular actor playing the Hobbit. He's a great actor. They had great actors there. They had a great director there, the producer. I mean, and on top of that, because of the modern way to make special effects, it makes it a lot more convincing. I think one of the reasons people did not like fantasy movies back in the day were the practical effects. And if you really wanted to make a good fantasy movie or a sci-fi movie, you would have to spend millions of dollars on special effects. In Star Wars, the special effects took years to create. Like spaceships that right now, if you buy those original spaceships that were in the movie, they're thousands, millions of dollars right now. Like you cannot buy one of those. They're in museums at this point, right? Because they're so, like they were like special effects. It took them a really long time to do it. If you didn't hire a huge special effects, like spend millions of dollars on it, your special effects will look really bad, really campy. Look at the Godzilla movies, right? It was a guy in a rubber suit, walking over a miniature Tokyo with little miniature cars. It was bad, And so with Lord of the Rings, it's interesting because I felt like a lot of Lord of the Rings in the books was not necessary. I felt like the story could have been one book or maybe two books instead of three books. And that was another reason why I think that, you don't want to just fill up space. I do remember back in the day, they were talking about how a lot of, and this is why, classical books and stuff like that, a lot of them are just long because you got paid by the page. If your story was bigger, you'd get paid more. And I think the reason for that is people were, I guess, back in the day, they tended to buy books that were larger. Now it's just people don't really care about how big the book is. And the publisher doesn't care about how big the book is. And honestly, a book of 200 pages might be $10, and a book of 300 pages or 400 pages would be $11. It wouldn't be that big of a difference. If you look at something like Michael Moorcock's books, Elric's Story, the Chronicles of Corum, and stuff like that, his books were thin. His books were 200 pages each. I love that because it's easy, it's portable, you can put in your pocket. That's why they call them pocket books, right? Better than those big hardcover things that you can only you have to sit down and read. You can't you can't, they're heavy, they're big. Smaller books are easy, fast stories. And then he just made 5 of those, 6 of those for the whole entire series, right? It all evens out in the end. And so with the movies, everything came together. The director, the producer, the special effects were great. The voice acting, the voice acting of the dragon was really done professionally. The Hobbit, good actors. They did it right. They did it right. And they really wanted to make a great movie, and they got recognized for it. And, people are saying, some people are saying that these are some of the greatest movies ever made. Now, the thing is, I haven't watched all of them. I watched some of it. I really do want to sit down and watch all 3 Lord of the Rings movies. I did watch the spin-off. I saw the entire series of Rings of Power, and it was beautiful. It was sort of like Lord of the Rings, but it was different. The characters were different. What I like about it and stories like that is they use the universe. And I think once you create a universe, you should be able to create more stories in it, even if the main characters are different, even if the stories are different, even if the details are different, the actors, directors. Once you have the universe, the world built, you can play in it. You know what I mean? You can make stories out of it. You can continue it. And with Lord of the Rings, Desolation of Smaug, and I'm not saying exactly what this is because I haven't seen it yet, and Rings of Power and Desolation, you could see that with Desolation of Smaug, that's what they're doing. They're continuing the Hobbit stories. Well, why not? Why not? That's what they did with Star Wars. They were let's just keep making Star Wars. And of course, they don't have Han Solo. They're not going to have those actors. They're not going to have Harrison Ford, unfortunately. And what was the thing about, there was an interesting thing that they did with Harrison Ford in one of the Star Wars movies. And what they did with Harrison Ford was they put him in the thing as Han Solo, right? And 20 years later, 30 years later, the guy's older. They put him in as Han Solo, but they put him in as Han Solo for 20, 30 minutes of the movie. And then they went back to all of the other actors they had. Now, if you're going to put Harrison Ford in your movie, just make it, it would have been better, I think. And the movie was okay, except for the parts where Harrison Ford was in it. So, if you're going to put Harrison Ford, why not, I think a good idea for a Star Wars movie was just make a movie about Han Solo and the journey of Han Solo and just have that. Because he is basically, I would say he was the most interesting character, or one of the most interesting characters and different characters in Star Wars. Luke Skywalker was an interesting character. Obi-Wan Kenobi was an interesting character. Darth Vader was an interesting character, right? These are interesting characters. They're completely all different from each other. Yoda is different than anyone, right? He's a puppet. He's a Muppet. He's not actually a character, but his personality and everything like that, different than everyone else. No one's the same. So you can make a movie about Yoda. You can make a movie just about Luke Skywalker, even if you have a different actor. You could, right? They had a different actor for Obi-Wan Kenobi in the prequels. They did that. They had a different actor for Darth Vader in the prequels, right? So it doesn't really matter. People will forgive if you change the actor just to make the story. They're just going to be like, okay, we're using a different actor, but it's the same character, just someone else playing it. And the proof of that is the James Bond, right? You had so many different actors playing James Bond, and no one cares. As long as the movie's good, as long as the actor is good, right? You can have a different character, a different actor, James Bond. You can have Sean Connery, Roger Moore, Pierce Brosnan, right? You can have James Bond with different characters. It's still James Bond, right? Even if he acts different, even if his personality is different, it doesn't really matter. He's got his thing where he's still James Bond, and it's still a James Bond movie. And what I like also, going back to Lord of the Rings, is that you can keep doing this, and you can keep making Lord of the Rings movies, Hobbit movies, because you already have the characters there. You can have spin-offs, you can have the same characters, you can have different characters. You can explore more areas of the story and more areas of the thing. And with the books, I like the books, but I always like watching it in a movie because the action is there. Books are not good at describing action, right? Movies are better with action. Movies do certain things better. Visuals, special effects, there's magic in it. There's action in it. There's a lot of beautiful architecture. In the movie, you can see how the elves looked, how the dwarves looked, how they talked, how the hobbits looked, how, the wizards looked, and all the different characters and the monsters. You could see, the Eye of Sauron, how that looked. That was cool. The dragon. I'd rather see a dragon in the movie than read about it. Because your experience with a book, even though it's a great experience with a lot of books, and a lot of books they've never made movies out of, so you can only get that experience in the book. But it's basically words, right? It's words to describe, to make you see what's going on in the story, and make you imagine what the story's doing. When you have a live action thing, and this is why for thousands of years people have had theater, right? Yeah, they've had books. But even before books became popular, theater was popular. In days and times where people didn't read and couldn't read, theater was the only way they could actually, get a story. Or just listening to stories around a campfire, right? Or listening to people, or bards back in the day. Bards knew how to read and tell stories and play music and all that kind of stuff. Whereas, if a bard wrote a book, and so a lot of people would be they wouldn't read it. It was hard to reproduce it. Until the printing press came out and people started to be oh, you got to be able to read. And I really do think that part of the reason why people started to read was the printing press. And I think the newspapers, in order to sell their newspapers, in order to sell their books, because the printing press became an industry and people started writing books, people wanted to read those books. But also, that industry was you got to learn to read, and convinced everyone that they need to learn to read. Just the fitness industry convinces everyone you got to go to the gym and jog and eat salads and stuff like that, right? That's the same reason. There's an industry there that's going to profit from you knowing how to read. There's an industry there that's going to profit from you going to the gym and buying, healthy food and stuff like that, and green shakes and things like that, And with the movie, you're able to see it. You're able to experience it visually. and it cuts out, because you can only like fit so much in a 2-hour movie, especially like, even if 3 2-hour movies. It cuts out the unnecessary stuff that they have in the books. Because like even like back, I mean, I did hear, I don't know if this is true or not, but the rumor is that Tolkien was paid basically, like they were like, you got to write 3 books. And the story was not like, he didn't have a story that would fit in 3 books, so he had to extend the story, make it longer, and just keep on, you know, doing it. And I think like even if you have like a movie with like 20 minutes of something unnecessary or not interesting in the movie, it's just better to edit it out. It's better to just cut out the part that's not interesting in the movie, have the movie shorter, and just people will enjoy it. Because like, you know, you don't want to have parts that people are really going to be like, oh, this is boring, or that nothing is happening, you know. And I feel like that's the thing about the books. And I feel like also with Lord of the Rings becoming a movie, as well as, you know, other books becoming movies, is fantasy books. To turn them into movies, I think, is like the thing that we should actually be doing. Because if Hollywood wants an idea of what the next big movie is going to be, it's already been written. Look at the books. Look at the fantasy books. Look at all the great books that have not become movies yet. Yeah, Neil Gaiman and, you know, Tolkien and J.R.R. Martin, these guys, they already, you know, they made movies about them already. Like Watchmen, and like, you know, Alan Moore, he didn't want his stuff to become a movie, but they made a movie anyway, and he was mad about it. It was his story, and they shouldn't have done it if he didn't want it to be done. But I liked the movie, The Watchmen, and stuff like that. So, and that's the thing about it. And actually, it's also like easier to take in a movie than it is to sit there and read a book. So, that's the thing, you know, it cuts a lot of the unnecessary and stuff in the books that really didn't go anywhere. You know, that's what I think about it. And I really think that once you make a movie about it and people, that becomes more popular than a book. And so the crowds and people say, we want more of this, and they're going to make more of this. So that's really, really cool, as well as we're not going to get any more Lord of the Rings books, obviously, from Tolkien. So we're only going to get movies, and hopefully they're going to make more and more movies about that. And so I'm really, really on board with these Lord of the Rings movies, as well as like fantasy movies from other books that they could just do. And I think people really, really like them, stuff like that. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments. Give it a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you guys in another video later.